You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why maybe these conversations are not being had because many industries would take a big hit. And so to control it, I think it's a quote you gave about when Tesla was able to build a car without an engine or without a battery. And I think he was talking to an entrepreneur at the time. I don't know if it was Edison or Ford. Who was it he was
Oh,
talking
he
to?
was talking to J.P. Morgan.
He was talking to
So,
JP
so
Morgan.
yeah, Tesla actually had a prototype car that was pulling energy out of the environment, and he didn't really understand what that was. We do now. It's called zero-point energy or quantum vacuum energy. But basically, just for people who are non-scientific, not scientists, if you visualize a coffee cup, the amount of space inside that cup has enough energy to boil off all the oceans of the planet in its potential. And it's called the zero-point energy field. It's been quantified. It was in academic papers in the 50s, so-called Professor Casimir effect. But Tesla stumbled across this way back, early 20s, I believe, maybe before. But J.P. Morgan said, look, if we can't put a meter on it, we don't want it. So Tesla died a very bitter man. I always joke that Elon Musk doesn't have a Tesla that he's manufacturing. He has a Musk. And the reason I say that sort of jokingly is that a true Tesla would never have to be plugged into the grid. It would be pulling energy out of this state of energy that's around us through very high voltage systems. They're called VHV, very high voltage systems that create an opening into that energy field. And Tesla did enough experimentation with these sort of very high voltage systems at certain resonant frequencies, cycles per second, hertz, that he broke into that area of science, but no one wanted it to come out. Now, fast forward 100 years later, we're still burning gasoline in engines and rocket fuel and jets. And that's a tragedy for the human race, but it's a tragedy for the planet. And it's a tragedy for our children and my 9 grandchildren. So my concern is, the future. The past is the past, but we have to figure out how to catch up sort of back to the future. It's like that cartoon show, The Jetsons, when they showed people flying around in these cars. When that cartoon was made, those technologies were already developed.
Going back to what you said about free press, you were mentioning the fact that we think we have a free press, but we don't. Were you alluding to Project Mockingbird?
Yes, of course, Project Mockingbird, and there are others that existed where, for example, a constitutional attorney, Daniel Sheehan, that's in this new documentary, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, he states that when he was representing the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers scandal back in the 70s during the Vietnam War, he saw a document that listed 42 different people who were senior national security editors at major media who were also dual purposed on the payroll of the CIA. And he thought this was a very significant thing in terms of freedom of the press and independence of the press. And but nobody would let that story get reported because it's scandalously corrupt. Because the free press and the Fourth Estate is one of the pillars of a democracy, and that sort of gives sort of makes a mock. Project Mockingbird made a mockery of that. And then, in my own adventures back in the 90s, I was meeting with Bob Schwartz in New York. He was on the board of Time Life, which became AOL, Time Warner, blah, blah, blah. And, he was an older gentleman who had, good friends with Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes and what have you. And I was with him at a gathering in New York. I was doing a briefing for a lot of the New York, I hate to use the word elites, but, leaders, the so-called New York 100. And when I was at this meeting, he turned to me, he says, the Fourth Estate is dead. I said, what do you mean? He says, we're scribes taking dictation from the right hand of the king. He says, we don't have a Fourth Estate. There is no free press in the United States on the things that really matter. And then he told me this story Mr. Schwartz told me this story of his friend Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes was given some documents about these UFO covert programs, and Mike Wallace wanted to do the story, and CBS in 60 Minutes say, you will not do this story. And Mike Wallace went into a very deep depression over this, that he later admitted to the public that he was very depressed. But he said on Larry King, I had been on Larry King around this time, and he said on Larry King Live, which was a host on CNN back in the old days, and he said, I'm a fraud. And Larry said, what do you mean you're a fraud? To Mike Wallace. And he wouldn't go into the details, but this is the backstory. Bob Schwartz told me, look, he was devastated that the biggest story that would have been ever in investigative journalism, CBS jumped in and killed it and wouldn't let it be broadcast or even pursued on 60 Minutes, which of course at that time was the blue chip investigative reporting, news magazine on network television. So that's this is something that's sort of a side issue to what I'm working on, but it's a big part of why when you turn on your television set, even if you get these leaked Pentagon videos that came out, they re-released them this past week. You probably saw them on CNN and elsewhere. Yep. They're not going to say, A, we know what these are. B, we know where they come from. C, we figured out how they work. Let me give you a date that's going to probably curl your toes. October 1954. That was the date we mastered gravity control. Now, what do I mean by gravity control? What I mean by gravity control are high voltage systems that cause an object to what looks like levitate or move the way that vehicle that you saw in that video released by the Pentagon this week. And they confirmed, yes, this is real footage. And they released 3 different videos. What they didn't say, because the people releasing it don't know this because of the compartmentalization, is that there is an unacknowledged compartmented program that began studying this in the 40s and 50s, and by 1954 had figured out how those things operate. So not to confuse your viewers any more than I probably already have, but so when you see one of these objects, you have to ask a question. Is it a classified aerospace project from the Lockheed Skunk Works or my uncle's company, Northrop Grumman, or is it interstellar, extraterrestrial? And both are out there, by the way, but no one's asking the question, is it A or B?